Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are jumping right in to a really fascinating topic, the modern sociological concept of American identity. And to really understand it, we're going to trace the vast, incredibly diverse historical tapestry of the United States. It's an amazing journey that actually connects thousands of years of history directly to how people view themselves today. So let's start with a pretty fundamental question. What does it actually mean to be American? It's a massive question, right? Well, researcher Deborah J. Schildkraut decided to tackle it head-on in her sociological study. She wanted to figure out if America's increasing ethnic diversity is fundamentally changing the normative content of its identity. Basically, are the unwritten rules of what makes an American shifting? Her empirical study zeroes in on this wonderfully simple yet deep question: how much there is there? She set out to test the popular claim that a more multicultural America will inevitably create a multi-creedal America. In other words, as demographics shift, does the core belief system fracture, does it multiply, or does it somehow stay exactly the same? Okay, let's unpack the core concept behind her research, which is the multiple traditions theory. This is a sociological perspective suggesting that, honestly, there isn't just one single, simple measure of Americanism. Instead, being American is defined by a broad, complex, and sometimes entirely contradictory set of norms. It's a layered tapestry, not just a single thread. To really grasp what this study found, we're going to walk through this history in 6 quick steps. First, what American identity actually is. 2, indigenous societies. 3, the era of colonization. 4, revolution and expansion. 5, the modern superpower. And finally, 6, a shared complex identity. So kicking things off with Section 1, what is American identity and how do we define those norms? Which brings us to Section 2, the deep roots of indigenous societies, going back tens of thousands of years. You know, this foundation is incredibly ancient. Human presence dates back maybe 30,000 years ago, when Paleo-Indians crossed the Beringia land bridge from Eurasia, hunting Ice Age megafauna like mammoths. Then farming kicks off around 8,000 BCE. Jump to 600 BCE, and the Adena culture is constructing these massive earthwork mounds. And by the 12th century, the Mississippian city of Cahokia, which was right near modern-day St. Louis, reached an estimated population of 20,000 people. To put that into perspective, Cahokia was literally larger than London at that time. No way, right? Long before European arrival, the continent was already humming with a complex web of hundreds of culturally distinct groups, trade systems, and political confederacies. Up in the Pacific Northwest, you had affluent societies centered entirely around salmon and these elaborate gift-giving feasts known as potlatches. Down in the Southwest, the Anasazi built massive stone and adobe pueblos, basically early apartment complexes carved right into the cliffs. Over in the Northeast, the Iroquois formed a highly sophisticated political confederacy of 50 sachem chiefs. And far out in the Pacific, Hawaii was being settled by Tahitian explorers. That takes us right into Section 3, the era of colonization and European arrival. Now, when European colonization began, it collided with and tragically decimated these established indigenous societies, largely through war and horrific epidemics of new diseases like smallpox. Multiple European powers started carving up the land, and each injected their own distinct and often brutal layers into the continent's history. The very first recorded European mention was actually Norse explorers way back in 1075 CE, talking about Vinland. Later, the Spanish arrived in places like Florida, New Mexico, and Puerto Rico, bringing the really harsh encomienda labor system with them. The Dutch set up New Netherland in the mid-Atlantic, and of course, the British establishments in Jamestown and Plymouth, which eventually became the 13 colonies. Each of these groups brought completely different cultural, economic, and legal norms to the table. Moving right along to Section 4, Revolution, Expansion, and War, the forging of a new nation. Things moved incredibly fast from there. Driven by British taxation and acts meant to crush self-governance, the Revolutionary War breaks out in April 1775. By July 1776, independence is declared, and in September 1787, the U.S. Constitution is signed. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase literally doubles the size of the nation, kicking off an aggressive wave of westward expansion fueled by Manifest Destiny. Now, this expansion, built heavily on settler colonialism and displacing indigenous peoples, skyrocketed tensions over the legality of slavery in these new territories, and that ultimately boiled over in 1861 into the Civil War, a devastating conflict fought directly over the institution of slavery. Here is where it gets absolutely crucial for understanding modern American identity. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the nation entered an era of deep, profound contradictions. On one hand, you have the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment and the Reconstruction era explicitly protecting individual constitutional rights. But at the exact same time, you see the rise of systemic white supremacy in the South through Jim Crow laws and violent voter suppression. The country is being pulled in two entirely different moral directions. Throw in the massive industrialization of the Gilded Age, waves of immigration, and sweeping progressive era reforms like women's suffrage, and you have a period completely defined by competing values.
Next up is Section 5, the modern superpower, as a global force emerges.
The 20th century was an absolute whirlwind of global involvement. We're talking entry into World War I in 1917, surviving the crushing decade of the Great Depression starting in 1929, and then getting pulled into World War II in 1941. The U.S. helps defeat the Axis powers only to immediately plunge into the Cold War, a massive rivalry with the Soviet Union featuring arms races, proxy wars, and the space race. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. And looking at the 2020s, the nation is still deeply intertwined globally, balancing conflicts in the Middle East with hugely ambitious goals like the Artemis program heading back to the moon. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, a shared, complex identity, which brings us right back to Schildkraut's sociological study. Think about all that history we just covered. Thousands of years of indigenous roots, overlapping European colonizations, intense domestic conflicts over civil rights and slavery, and a rapid rise to global superpower status. It makes total sense that the reality of a multi-creedal America completely shatters the myth of a single, simple American creed. You just can't look at a history that messy and diverse and expect to find only one neat little definition of what it means to be an American. And Schildkraut's data backs this up perfectly. The findings explicitly point out that a complex and contradictory set of norms exist, and it is difficult to reduce them into a single measure of Americanism. The numbers prove that being American today is defined by a broad, highly varied range of norms that perfectly reflect the layered history we just walked through. But here is the real kicker, the part that's actually super unifying. Despite this incredibly chaotic historical tapestry, most Americans, whether they come from a family of recent immigrants or long-standing citizens, regardless of their ethnic background, actually shared this complex, multi-layered view of their own identity. They recognize the contradictions, they embrace the fact that there isn't just one way to be American. The very complexity of the identity is, in a way, the shared identity. So, I want to leave you with this to chew on. As America continues to face new global and domestic challenges, how will these multiple traditions shift and redefine what it means to be American in the future? Because if history tells us anything, it's that this identity is never static. It's always evolving. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this gave you a clear, structured lens for a really complex topic. Keep learning, and I will catch you next time.